Number 3, Ronald Mitchell, Dylan Jocko, and Eric Mearow. Sault Ste. Marie is a city in northern Ontario, Canada. Across the St. Mary's River is the twin city, Sault Ste. Marie, Michigan. In 2011, Sault Ste. Marie, Ontario, also known as the Sioux, was home to just over 72,000 people. One of them was 29-year-old Wesley Hallam. On January 11, 2011, most of his body was found floating in a creek. His head, hands, and feet were missing. Weeks later, his head and right foot were found in a Michigan landfill. The rest of his remains weren't found. It was determined he was stabbed and then he was dismembered with an electric saw. The police launched an investigation and learned that on the night of January 7, 2011, 3 days before Hallam's headless body was found, he attended a house party in the Sioux. Several people who attended the party told the police a disturbing story. Hallam had arrived at the party at around 11:30 p.m. He did some cocaine and then started showing off a knife he was carrying. It was a big, double-edged blade. Two people saw the knife, Eric Mearow and Dylan Jocko, who were both 26 years old, didn't like that there was a swastika marked on the knife. Mearow was First Nations, and Jocko's roots were First Nations. Hallam put the knife away. Several people went into Eric Mearow's bedroom to do some more cocaine. This included Hallam and 26-year-old Ronald Mitchell. In the bedroom, Hallam and Mitchell began arguing. Hallam and Mitchell were involved in the criminal and drug worlds. They started calling each other goof, which is a derogatory term in Ontario jails and prisons. Often, calling someone a goof leads to a physical fight. Mitchell and Hallam started fighting, and Hallam was winning the fight. Then Mearow burst into the room and pulled him off Mitchell. Hallam pulled out his knife. Mitchell also had a knife on him, so he pulled it out. Hallam and Mitchell swung their knives at each other. Then Jocko came into the room and he jumped on Hallam's back. Jocko and Mitchell wrestled the knife away from Hallam and it fell to the floor. Mearow kicked the knife away. Mearow then joined the melee by punching and kicking Hallam. He knocked him towards Ronald Mitchell, who stabbed him twice at the left side of the neck. What happened next isn't exactly clear. What is known is that Hallam was taken to the bathroom. Mearow decided they had to dismember the body. He and Jocko found an electric saw. Mitchell guarded the bathroom so no one could bother them. Jocko cut off Hallam's head, hands, and feet under Mearow's direction. The head and other body parts were put into garbage bags, then thrown into several dumpsters. The rest of the body was dumped into the creek. Although there were dozens of people at the party, none of them called for an ambulance or told the police about the murder and dismemberment at the party. Within weeks, Ronald Mitchell, Dylan Jocko, and Eric Mearow were all arrested. The three men were scheduled to go to trial in 2016, over 5 years after the murder. In 2016, unbeknownst to the police and Wesley Hallam's family, the prosecution, which in Canada is called the Crown, offered the three men a plea deal. They could plead guilty to manslaughter and they wouldn't have to spend more than 2 more years in jail. The men agreed to the deal. In July 2019, the three men pleaded guilty to manslaughter. Mitchell, who had stabbed Hallam, was sentenced to 22 months in jail. Mearow and Jocko were sentenced to 2 years less a day. In Canada, if someone is sentenced to less than 2 years, they are sent to a provincial jail instead of a federal penitentiary. Many people were upset by the plea deal, especially Hallam's mother. The chief of police was highly critical of the deal and asked for a third-party review of the case. Several people who attended the party and cooperated with the police were also terrified. In less than 2 years, the three men who killed and dismembered a man at a house party would be walking around their city of 72,000 people. They believed they might be in danger. On the day of the sentencing, about 50 people gathered outside the courthouse to protest the plea deal. The Crown defended the plea deal by saying there were, quote, potential frailties in evidence, unquote. Notably, Hallam may have provoked the fight that led to his death. Also, the three men were all drunk and high at the time of the murder, and the defense could argue they were too messed up to know what was going on. A big problem for many people was the agreed statement of facts used to create the plea deal. An agreed statement of facts is a document in a Canadian trial where the prosecution and defense both accept certain facts as true, removing the need to prove them in court. This helps streamline the proceedings and focuses the trial on the remaining disputed issues. In the case of the three men, the statement did not match eyewitness accounts and the autopsy report. In the agreed statement of facts, Hallam was dead by the time he was placed in the bathtub. However, several people at the party said that the three men held Hallam in the bathroom while he was dying. He screamed for help and for someone to call an ambulance. One person claimed that they heard Hallam beg for help, and Mearow said, quote, no help for you, unquote. The witness then said she saw Mearow slit Hallam's throat. If the men could find Hallam while he was still alive, it would have been first-degree murder. In Canada, unlawful confinement is an element of first-degree murder. Another problem was that it was alleged that there was a fight and Mitchell stabbed Hallam twice in the neck. But according to the coroner, there were 40 stab wounds on Hallam's body. Some were defensive wounds. 2 stab wounds in the neck are mentioned in the statement of facts. However, Hallam suffered 6 other stab wounds in the head. Also, 2 knives were used. Many people thought there was enough physical evidence and eyewitnesses that the men could have been convicted of first-degree murder, which in Canada is an automatic sentence of 25 years to life. Instead, they were released on probation just over a year after they were convicted. Ronald Mitchell was released in October 2017, and Eric Mearow and Dylan Jocko were released a month later. They had all served about 6.5 years for murdering, decapitating, and dismembering Wesley Hallam and throwing his remains into the trash in a creek. Since being released, Eric Mearow has continued to get into trouble. In 2018, Mearow was sentenced to 3.5 years after 4 guns were found in the apartment where he was staying. In May 2022, there was a home invasion in Sault Ste. Marie. One person was assaulted, and another person was shot and seriously injured. Mearow and another man, Travis Parsons, were arrested. A year later, there was a preliminary hearing, and a key witness didn't show up. The judge ended up throwing out the case due to lack of evidence. Mearow was then released from jail. 3 months after being released, he was arrested again in August 2023 for assaulting a person on 2 different occasions. Not much is known about the assault. He was released from custody in January 2025. Months later, in July 2025, Mearow was arrested again. On July 14th, he was driving his motorcycle when he lost control and crashed into a ditch. He ran from the scene. He was arrested and charged with dangerous operation, careless driving, and failure to remain, among other charges. At the time of this recording, it appears he is still in custody. Dylan Jocko also continued to get into trouble. After he was released, he moved 400 miles south to London, Ontario. He had to stay in London as part of his probation. But he left the city in late 2021, and the police in Sault Ste. Marie were notified. On January 4, 2022, Jocko was spotted in the Sioux, and as officers approached him, he ran. As he ran, he threw away a sawed-off shotgun he was carrying. He was arrested, and he had fentanyl and methamphetamine on him. Jocko said he was holding the gun as a favor to someone. Months later, he pleaded guilty and he was sentenced to 2 years in jail. The judge thought this was enough time to help him with his substance abuse problems. 40-year-old Dylan Jocko died in June 2025. At the time, he was not incarcerated. The cause of death was never released. Ronald Mitchell has stayed out of the news since being released. His current whereabouts are unknown, but he would be about 40 years old at the time of this recording. Number 2. Mustapha Dib. On October 17, 1998, 14-year-old Edward Lee and 4 friends were going to attend a 15th birthday party for a young woman they knew in Sydney, Australia. When they arrived in the area, they saw about 20 young people hanging out in front of a house. They assumed it was the party and they started to make their way through the crowd. But they were wrong, it was not a party. The group of young men was described in most articles as, quote, a gang of Lebanese teens, unquote. One of the teens, 18-year-old Mustapha Dib, asked one of Edward's friends what they were doing and pushed him. The friend then punched Mohammed and knocked him out. Mohammed's brother, 15-year-old Mustapha Dib, was nearby, and he saw his brother get knocked out. Mustapha ran into the fray with a 5.5-inch kitchen knife. He stabbed 14-year-old Edward Lee in the chest and the back, puncturing his lung and heart. Mustapha then ran off, yelling that the Asian deserved it. Edward's friends carried him to their car and started driving away. As they were escaping, one of the young Lebanese men fired a gun at them. They fired 5 times and one bullet broke the back window. However, no one was injured in the shooting. Sadly, there was nothing that could be done for 14-year-old Edward Lee, and he died. The police descended on the area where the shooting happened. There were about 130 people on the street at the time of the stabbing, but they all refused to cooperate with the police, so no arrests were made in the case. 2 long years went by. Then in 2000, the police started doing undercover work on the street. They had undercover officers buy drugs from different dealers on the street. Then in August 2000, the police arrested several dealers. They were hoping to get one of the dealers to talk about the murder. One of the people they arrested was 22-year-old Ahmed Banat. Ahmed had been on the street the night Edward Lee was murdered. On November 23, 2000, Ahmed was in the car with his 20-year-old wife, Anita Furzinza, and the toddler child they had together. Anita was 6 months pregnant with her second child. A car pulled up to them, and a person in that vehicle fired 4 shots at them. Ahmed was shot in the neck, and Anita was shot in the stomach. The toddler was unharmed. Ahmed and Anita were both taken to the hospital. Ahmed survived his injury, but 20-year-old Anita did not. It's unclear if the baby she was carrying survived. The police talked to Ahmed Bennett, and he said that Mustapha Dib was the shooter. Ahmed and Mustapha had been school friends. The police concluded that Mustapha wanted to kill Ahmed to make sure he didn't say anything about Edward Lee's murder to the police. 3 days after Anita and Ahmed were shot, Mustapha, who was a few weeks shy of his 18th birthday, was arrested and charged with the murders of Edward Lee and Anita Furzinza. Mustapha Dib first went to trial for the murder of Edward Lee. It began in September 2002. By the 3rd week of the trial, the prosecution believed the case was in trouble. They decided to offer Mustapha a plea deal. He could plead guilty to manslaughter and get a sentence of a minimum of 5 years to a maximum of 10 years. But for the second time in the history of New South Wales, the judge rejected the plea deal. So the trial was aborted. Months later, in February 2003, the plea deal was brought before another judge, and the new judge accepted the plea deal. With time served, Mustapha was eligible for parole in just 3 years. Edward Lee's parents were devastated by the news of the plea deal. They thought that the sentence was too lenient for the murder of their only child. The Attorney General was also concerned about the plea deal and asked for it to be appealed. However, that did not happen. Instead, later that same year, Mustapha went to trial for the murder of Anita Furzinza. The main evidence against him was Ahmed Banat's identification of him as the shooter. But instead of testifying, Ahmed fled the country. so the trial was once again aborted. In August 2009, Mustapha was released from prison after he finished his sentence for the murder of 14-year-old Edward Lee. He had served about 9 years for the murder. Meanwhile, the police searched for Ahmed Banat. In 2011, Ahmed was found in Jordan, where he was arrested for attempting to pervert the course of justice. He was extradited to Australia. In June 2012, 3 years after being released for killing Edward Lee, Mustapha Dib went on trial for Anita Verzinza's murder. The prosecution said that Mustapha had motive to kill Ahmed. Mustapha wanted to make sure that Ahmed didn't identify him as the person who stabbed Edward Lee. Also, near the scene of the shooting, the police found a hat with Mustapha's DNA inside of it. Ahmed testified, and he had a different story than what he told the police. He said he didn't know for sure if it was Mustapha who shot him and his wife. He said he believed it was Mustapha, but he said that the shooter and the other people in the car were wearing masks. The jury found Mustapha guilty of murder. In November 2012, he was sentenced to 40 years of prison with a 30-year non-parole term. He was going to be eligible for parole in July 2041. Mustapha's lawyers appealed the conviction. On August 31, 2016, there was an appeal hearing. Mustapha's lawyers argued that there was reasonable doubt in the case. For example, Ahmed didn't positively identify Mustapha. Also, the prosecution alleged that the motive behind the shooting was that Mustapha believed that Ahmed had talked to or planned to talk to the police about the murder of Edward Lee. However, there is no evidence that Mustapha knew that Ahmed had talked or planned to cooperate with the police. In February 2016, the conviction was overturned and Mustapha was acquitted. The appeal court unanimously ruled that there was enough reasonable doubt that Mustapha wasn't the shooter. Mustapha was released that day after spending just over 3 years of prison. Many people were upset about the appeal. They felt that Mustapha murdered a 14-year-old boy and then murdered a 20-year-old pregnant woman while trying to kill a witness to the first murder, and he only spent 12 years in prison. They felt it was a mockery of the justice system. It sent the message that a person could get away with murder if they killed a witness or a witness's family member. Mustapha Dib continued to have problems with the law after being acquitted. In 2017, he was arrested in Dubai for being part of a drug network that was trying to smuggle over 2 tons of MDMA from the Netherlands into Australia. Mustapha was going to get $1 million for the deal. Mustapha was extradited to Australia. Mustapha was convicted, and in April 2020, he was sentenced to a maximum of 18 years and 2 months in prison. He has a non-parole period of 12 years, which is how much time he spent in prison for 2 murders. Including time served, Mustapha Dib is eligible for parole in 2029. Number 1. Lisa Peng. In August 1993, Ranbing Yi, who went by Jennifer, lived in Mission Vallejo, California. She came to the United States from China about a year earlier. She had a 5-month-old son, Kevin. On August 18, 1993, Jennifer and Kevin were found dead in their apartment. Jennifer had been stabbed 18 times and was bitten on the arm. Kevin had been suffocated with a piece of clothing. The police immediately got the sense that the murders were personal. Nothing was stolen from the home. There were no signs of a break-in or forced entry. It suspected that Jennifer knew her killer and let them into the apartment. Also, the violence of the murders was intense and showed a lot of rage. It seemed like the actions of someone who hated Jennifer. Also, why did the killer do anything to Kevin? The police investigated Jennifer's personal life. In October 1990, Jennifer was working as a hostess in China. She met Peng, who went by Jim. Jim, who was in his 50s, was electronics tycoon estimated to be worth over $200 million. He split his time between Taiwan and Rancho Santa Margarita, California. Initially, Jim hired Jennifer to work for him. In May 1991, they started a romantic relationship, and she became pregnant with Kevin. Jim moved Jennifer to the United States and financially supported her. Jim was the one who discovered the bodies. The police investigated Jim, but he had an ironclad alibi. He was out of the country on business when the murders were committed. When he got back to California, the first thing he did was go to the apartment and find the bodies. Jim was also given a polygraph, which he passed. It turned out that Jennifer was Jim's mistress. Jim was married to 44-year-old Peng, who went by the name Lisa. Lisa and Jim had 2 teenage children. Lisa had quit her career to help support Jim's business, which turned out to be very successful. The police learned that Jennifer and Lisa were aware of each other. One time, Lisa returned home early from a trip and discovered Jim and Jennifer together in their home in California. One time, Lisa found Jennifer's clothes in her closet, so she cut them up. Lisa confessed that she had confronted Jennifer several times, but maintained she didn't kill her. However, the police believed that Lisa killed Jennifer in a fit of jealousy. It would also explain why Kevin was killed as well. The police got a DNA sample from Lisa. They compared it to the DNA from the saliva and the bite mark. 4 months later, the police learned that Lisa's DNA was a match to the saliva. Lisa was interrogated for 9 hours. Then Jim was brought into the interrogation room to help translate questions for booking. Jim asked for a private moment to speak with his wife, and the police consented. However, the police recorded their conversation. They spoke to each other in Mandarin. Lisa got mad at Jim for having the affair. Jim asked Lisa why she killed Jennifer. Lisa admitted going to Jennifer's apartment and biting her. She said that Jennifer attacked her with the knife, and then she fell onto the knife. The last words on the recording were Lisa saying, quote, "Don't say anything, I won't admit," unquote. The police had interpreters listen to the recording and make a transcript. After Lisa's arrest, she maintained her innocence, and she was supported by her husband, Jim. Jim even testified on her behalf at the preliminary hearing. However, when Lisa went to trial in August 1995, Jim was out of the country. The prosecution presented the DNA evidence and the transcript of Lisa admitting to being in Jennifer's apartment when she was killed as evidence. The defense had a different theory about the murders. They said that Jim arranged the murders. He was worried that a divorce would be a scandal for his company. The jury deliberated for 6 days. They could not reach a unanimous decision. The vote was 10 for conviction and 2 for acquittal. The 2 men who voted for acquittal weren't convinced that Lisa was in Jennifer's apartment when she was murdered. At the time, DNA evidence was still considered a new technology, and some people in the general public didn't understand or trust it. The O.J. Simpson trial was the first famous trial to use DNA evidence. Lisa's trial coincided with the Simpson trial. Since the jury was hopelessly deadlocked, a mistrial was declared. The district attorney decided to try Lisa again. Lisa Peng's second trial started in February 1994. It was the same evidence as the first trial. Once again, Lisa's lawyer said that Jim was the real killer. The lawyer said that Lisa and Jennifer were both victims of Jim. Once again, Jim was not in the United States for the trial. The trial lasted about 7 weeks. Then the jury deliberated for 5 days. This time, Lisa Lang was found guilty of first-degree murder. In September 1996, she was sentenced to life in prison. Then, 3 years later, in October 1999, there was a shocking twist. Lisa's conviction was overturned. The appeals court ruled that the statements Lisa made to her husband about being in Jennifer's apartment were inadmissible. After 9 hours of interrogation, Jim was brought into the room to translate for booking questions. Lisa, who was frazzled, talked to her husband when she thought they were having a private conversation. The appeals court believed that bringing in Jim was a form of coercion. Lisa Peng went to trial for a third time in May 2001. It had been 8 years since the murders of Jennifer and Kevin Yee. Throughout the ordeal, Jim and Lisa had stayed married. He visited her in jail when he was in California. However, he was out of the country for his wife's third trial. Once again, the DNA evidence was used to show that Lisa had killed Jennifer. However, the transcript of her admitting to being in Jennifer's apartment, biting her, and then Jennifer falling onto the knife wasn't allowed as evidence. The defense acknowledged that Lisa did bite Jennifer. However, they claimed that she bit her in a fight days before the murders. They said there was no evidence that Lisa was in the apartment at the time of the murders. The trial once again lasted about a month and a half. Then the jury deliberated for 6 days. Once again, a mistrial was declared because the jury was deadlocked. This time it was 8-4 to convict. The 4 people who wanted to acquit did not believe that the bite happened during the murder, but days earlier. Days after Lisa Peng's third trial for murder, the district attorney offered her a plea deal, and she accepted. 11 days after the end of her trial, Lisa pleaded guilty to 2 counts of manslaughter. She was sentenced to 11 years, which included time served. Because of good behavior time, she was eligible for parole immediately. Lisa was released, but as part of the plea deal, she was deported to her native Taiwan, where her husband lived. It's unknown what happened to Lisa Peng after she was deported, but many believe she went back to her life as an affluent wife of a tycoon. For murdering 25-year-old Jennifer Yee and 5-month-old Kevin, Lisa served about 8 years in prison. At the time of this recording, if Lisa Peng is still alive, she would be in her mid-70s. Thank you so much for watching today's video. If you enjoyed it, we'd really appreciate it if you subscribed. Also, don't forget to watch our shorts on YouTube, Instagram, and TikTok. Once again, thank you for watching.